This session is actually focused on outcome 3.3, which is obviously for Unit 3. Unit 1 was a synoptic unit which covered everything in a very thin film of it, as it were, at no depth really. But what did you actually do about assessment in Unit 1?
What do you actually do?
Well, what
in terms of teaching here?
In terms of teaching, yes. Not the assessed work that you did, but what elements of the principles of assessment were covered in Unit 1?
I don't think we did much in class on that. I think yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay, that's okay. Yeah, well, that's usually what happens with that unit. Yeah. Right. However, it's not quite as simple as that, because on conclusion of this session, I hope that you will be confused. That's what I'm setting out to do, to confuse you, and I'm very good at it. I can confuse anybody on those straightforward things. However, when I say confused, I mean basically that I hope to raise some of the challenges and problems surrounding the whole business of assessment, and make you aware of them, so that you can start thinking about how you address them in the way in which you devise resources, devise assessments and so on. A process which is known in the jargon as constructive alignment, but which we'll get onto in more depth later. So this is about identifying some of the problems, the inconsistencies, the difficulties of setting up good assessment regimes and exercises. So we hope that you're going to be confused, but at a higher level than before. That's been attributed to various sources, including the physicist Enrico Fermi and various other people, but still. But that's my general aim in teaching, that people end up confused, but in more sophisticated confusion than they had before they arrived. And it's worth saying, it's a bit of sort of a digression, and for goodness sake, do interrupt. As I've said before, I do litter on. A bit of a digression. One of the things which we're not allowed to do in teaching nowadays is confuse students, except possibly at this level. We can just about get away with it. But I mean, particularly within the further education sector, and I can't imagine that it's in any sense different in the military. The thing is to devise a teaching plan which will take people incrementally, step by step, in a linear fashion through all the material until they've accumulated enough stuff to be able to pass the assessment. And that is, in many respects, a great disadvantage, because the way in which people really get to grips with stuff and engage with it is when they go through some kind of trough of confusion, and that sort of niggles away at them in their mind. And when you've got a problem to solve, then it becomes much more satisfying, and you begin to arrive at solutions for yourself. So it's a considerable hindrance. I mean, it's very difficult to say that you set out to confuse people. That seems to be an irresponsible thing to do, but you've got to regard that it's a necessary stage in the process very often. And of course, one of the problems, particularly in the FE sector, is that they're so obsessed with retention and achievement statistics and the funding which goes with them, that you daren't put your students through it, as it were, in any way which sort of upsets them or saps their morale or makes them have any crisis of confidence or really any other feelings apart from the satisfaction of achievement, because they might stop coming. Simple. It's bums on seats. And so the processes, compliant processes, which are being adopted in a lot of FE settings nowadays, are about precisely avoiding anything which is to do with confusion. However, feel free to comment. Is that something which any of you recognise in relation to your own experience?
Yeah.
We get confusion now, but we don't have to worry so much about the bums on seats issue, right?
No, quite.
Well, that's the students who are doing the confusion.
I don't think they purposely go out to confuse. But I think it's the nature of what we're teaching
Yeah.
is different, so that causes confusion initially.
Yes.
Until we get into the practical bits,
Yeah.
where they then put that theory into practice.
Mm.
Doesn't work so much on the shorter courses, but definitely between 15-week course, 20-week course that we've got. Definitely.
Yes, that's an interesting point about the, and something which is very little considered in the educational literature, which is the shape of a course and what happens, particularly to student morale and so on in the course of that course, and the way in which you need to teach in order to be to contain that or to handle it.
We can literally track the changes of a student as we teach them all the sort of formal stuff, and they get very frustrated very quickly. And I think our course is probably on the sort of cusp of how long you can do it for, because when they get to the exercises where it all ties in together and they finally get the big picture, you can almost see them breathe a sigh of relief. Yeah, exactly. And they will come up to you and say, "This has been an excellent, practical, because now I understand all the stuff you've taught me." But I can see with the way they act that if it was a longer course, that you wouldn't get that effect. Yeah, they just get properly annoyed with it and stop listening completely.
To a large extent, I agree with you. I may differ a little bit, because the interesting thing on longer courses, if you start looking at them in this perspective, is that things start to come together, all probably with about 5 or 6 weeks to go, almost regardless of the length of the course. There's it's sometimes referred to in the group dynamics literature as the issue of endings, and trying to find a resolution to it, and people sort of commit themselves to doing that. So that you may have a sort of shape of the course which goes something like that. And of course the tricky thing is managing this trough at the bottom. But we'll come on to that in more detail perhaps when we look at the group work stuff, which I'll be doing later on. The reason for this is simply that it's analogous to the process of breaking the ground. In terms of creating a confusion is creating a sort of fertile soil. If you just simply distribute the seeds onto unbroken ground, they've got nowhere to germinate and grow from. So it's ploughing preparatory to the other work. So, talking about assessment itself, just a couple of points. I'm not going to go for formal definitions. Formal definitions are pretty useless in this business, as far as I'm concerned. Much more interested in how things work out in practice. Not what is assessment, but how do we do assessment. So you could say that assessment is the difference between presentation, which is what I'm doing at the moment, and actual teaching, because assessment, it's only when you start assessing whether people are any different at the end from the way they were at the beginning that you can say that you've actually taught them something. And we've talked before, or I've talked before at any rate, about John Hattie's meta-analysis on what works best in teaching and things like this. I've gone back to his 1992 statement because it's a bit more succinct than the one in his 2009 book. But he says the most simple prescription for improving education must be dollops of feedback. And basically the point is, of course, that assessment is a process of feedback. It's a process of feedback in two directions. One, to the student, of course, about how they're doing. So that if you pass it, you pass the assessment, you think you're going somewhere. There's also a process of feedback, which Hattie now emphasises almost as much as the first part, process of feedback to the teacher about how the student is doing, where the misconceptions are, where people are finding difficulties, where they're getting stuck, all those kind of bits. In fact, you could say that if you're going for a definition in almost systemic terms, as it were, assessment is whatever provides feedback. And so when we're talking about assessment in this context, before we get into the formal assessment bits further down the line, I'm suggesting that assessment is something which is going on all the time in the classroom. And as I'm glancing around looking at whether people have fallen asleep or whether they've got looks of incredulity on their faces or just sheer boredom. I'm getting some kind of feedback about what you're experiencing, and of course, if you talk to me, I get a clearer idea of what that is, and because you've got to all the time try to address where